A man stood at a hospital bedside in November 2005 and said nothing at all. That man was Bobby Charlton. The man in the bed was George Best, and the silence between them said more than any interview either of them ever gave. No cameras rolling for that moment. No quote given afterward. Just two old friends, or something close to it, standing in a room where words had clearly stopped being useful a long time ago. Because 6 years earlier, Best had done something almost nobody expected from him. He picked up a newspaper campaign, put his own ruined liver on the front page, and used the last of his fame for one message. 3 words. Don't die like me. Not a joke. Not a headline stunt. A warning from a dying man to strangers he'd never meet. But here's the part that gets buried every time this story gets told. Best wasn't the only one warning people. Bobby Charlton had been doing it for over 30 years. Quietly, persistently, and almost nobody listened to him either. This is the story of 2 Manchester United legends who should have been the greatest partnership English football ever produced. Instead, they barely spoke to each other on the pitch by the end. And the man history remembers as the disciplined one, the boring one, the survivor. He was the one person who saw the crash coming. For decades, the popular version of this relationship has been lazy at best. Charlton, the sensible one. Best, the wasted genius. 2 men who just didn't get along, chalked up to a personality clash, and left there. But personality clashes don't usually end with a liver transplant, a prison sentence, and a deathbed visit 30 years later. Something more structural was happening here, and almost nobody in a position to stop it ever tried. Let's go back to where it actually started. Not in the 60s. In 1958, on a snow-covered runway in Munich. February the 6th, 1958. A charter flight carrying Manchester United's players, staff, and journalists back from a European Cup tie in Belgrade attempted takeoff for the 3rd time in worsening weather. It didn't make it. 23 people died on that runway, including 8 of United's own players. Bobby Charlton survived. He was pulled from the wreckage, still strapped into his seat, thrown clear, alive by what most people who were there still call pure luck. He was 20 years old. Think about the mechanics of what a moment like that actually does to a young man. It's not just grief. Grief fades, or at least it changes shape over time. This was something closer to a permanent recalibration of what football was allowed to mean. Charlton went from a promising young player enjoying a game he was extremely good at to a survivor carrying the unspoken question every survivor eventually asked themselves, why me and not them? Football stopped being a career choice. It became the thing he owed to 8 men who never got to finish theirs. Now sit with that for a second, because this is the detail that explains everything that comes later. Charlton didn't walk away from Munich thinking he'd been given a second chance to enjoy life. He walked away thinking he'd been given a debt he could never fully repay. Teammates he'd grown up with, roomed with, trained beside, gone. And he was still standing, still able to play the game they died playing. For Charlton, football stopped being entertainment that day. It became an obligation, a duty performed on behalf of people who no longer got to do it themselves. That mindset never left him. Not in 1966, when he lifted the World Cup with England. Not in 1968, when he captained United to the European Cup, a decade almost to the day after Munich, and cried on the pitch at Wembley in a way that had nothing to do with celebration and everything to do with grief finally finding an outlet. Charlton played like a man clearing a debt. Every single week. 9 years after Munich, a 17-year-old kid from Belfast walked into that dressing room. George Best had been discovered almost by accident. A scout's tip-off, a skinny teenager United nearly sent home twice before he made his debut in 1963. By the mid-60s, he wasn't just good. He was doing things defenders had genuinely never seen before. Dragbacks, feints, close control at speed that looked less like football and more like a magic trick performed at match pace. And it wasn't just the football. Best was fast becoming the first genuine football celebrity of the modern era. Boutiques with his name above the door. Fashion shoots. Nightclubs. Newspapers started calling him the 5th Beatle, and for a 19 and 20-year-old in mid-60s Manchester, that wasn't hyperbole, that was just Tuesday. Best won the Ballon d'Or in 1968 at just 22 years old. He was, by a wide margin, the most talented player Britain had ever produced. And crucially, none of that fame arrived with a manual attached. There was no template in English football for what to do with a 20-year-old who could fill a nightclub just by walking through the door. Best was inventing the role of footballer as celebrity in real time, with no agent structure built for it, no media training, no club department whose job was to manage any of it. He was left to work it out for himself, at an age when most people are still working out how to do their own laundry. Here's where it starts to go wrong. Not with one incident, with a slow-motion mismatch between two men who represented completely different ideas of what it meant to play for Manchester United. Charlton saw the shirt as something sacred, purchased with other people's lives. Best saw it as a stage. Neither of them was wrong about what football could be, but they were building their entire careers on opposite foundations, in the same dressing room, and nobody at the club was doing anything to bridge that gap. That gap became a crisis after 1968. United had just won the European Cup with a squad built mostly around players in their late 20s and 30s. Instead of rebuilding around that peak, the club did almost nothing. No serious reinforcements. No succession plan. The same aging spine was expected to keep winning on reputation alone, and it didn't take long for the cracks to show. As results slid, the contrast between Charlton and Best didn't soften. It hardened. Charlton kept doing what he'd always done. Extra training, total professionalism, dragging himself through matches out of what looked less like ambition and more like penance. Best, meanwhile, was drifting. His attendance at training became unreliable. Nights out started bleeding into missed sessions. The gifts were still there when he showed up, but showing up itself had become the problem. And on the pitch, something genuinely painful started happening. Teammates who'd once built entire attacking moves around getting Best the ball started to stop looking for him. Best, in turn, stopped looking for them. Two of the most gifted footballers of their generation, wearing the same shirt, functionally playing two separate games. Nobody stepped in to fix it. That's the detail that gets skipped in most retellings. United's management through this period was weak, reactive, and frankly out of its depth. Matt Busby, the manager who'd built the club back up from the wreckage of Munich and shepherded it to that 1968 European Cup, stepped back from day-to-day control not long after, and the managers who followed him lacked both his authority in the dressing room and his standing with the board. There was no strong hand steering the squad through a difficult transition, no structure holding Best accountable in a way that might have actually helped him, no support system addressing what was clearly becoming a serious problem rather than just a discipline issue. The vacuum at the top of the club didn't just fail to solve the Best situation. It let it fester in full public view, season after season, while results slid and the newspapers filled in the gaps with speculation. It's worth saying plainly, this wasn't unique to Best, and it wasn't really about one player's character. It was a structural failure at a club that had won everything it could win with an aging core, then had no real plan for what came after. Best's personal struggles happened to be the most visible symptom of a much wider institutional drift, which is exactly why pinning the entire decline on him always felt too convenient, and always let the people actually running the club off the hook. Meanwhile, defenders across the league had figured something out. Best was virtually impossible to stop with the ball at his feet, so the solution for a lot of teams was simple and brutal. Stop him before he got it, and if that failed, stop him physically. Leeds United under Don Revie became the most notorious example. A team built to intimidate as much as outplay, and Best absorbed tackle after tackle that referees in that era simply weren't policing. Every match chipped a little more off a body that was still only in its mid-20s. Think about what that combination actually does to a young player over several consecutive seasons. Physically targeted more than almost anyone else on the pitch, with minimal protection from officials who simply weren't calling the game the way modern referees would. Emotionally unsupported by a club that had no real welfare structure to speak of, and publicly, endlessly scrutinized by a press that had built an entire industry around covering his nightlife, then acted shocked when the nightlife started affecting his football. It's a cycle. The more the tabloids covered the off-field chaos, the more pressure built. The more pressure built, the more Best pulled away from training. The more he pulled away, the more headlines it generated. Nobody at United ever broke that loop. They just watched it spin. Now, to be fair for a second, because this isn't a story where one side is purely a villain and the other purely a victim. Best wasn't some passive figure things happened to. He made choices. He missed sessions he didn't have to miss. He walked out on the club more than once before the final exit. Nobody forced him into any of that. But, to be fair, only stretches so far, because the environment around him was actively failing to catch him at every single point where intervention might have mattered. And there's one moment in this story that shows exactly how far apart Best and Charlton had drifted, and how much closer they might have stayed if either of them had known how to close the distance. In 1969, Best turned up at Charlton's house for dinner. Not a football conversation, a domestic one. Best reportedly asked Charlton about carpets, about cleaners, about the basic, unglamorous machinery of running a stable home life. The kind of thing a 23-year-old global celebrity with no functional support system around him genuinely had no idea how to build for himself. It's a small detail. It's also one of the most telling in the entire story. Underneath the fame, the tabloid persona, the boutique openings, there was a young man quietly reaching for stability and not knowing where to find it. Charlton saw that night for what it was. He recognized someone floundering. But by 1969, their lives had already drifted so far apart. Different friend groups, different values, different definitions of what united meant. That recognizing the problem and actually reaching him were two completely different things. Think about how strange that dinner actually is once you sit with it. This is George Best, the most famous young footballer on the planet, a man with his own fashion line and a fan base that behaved like he was in a band, sitting in a teammate's living room asking how ordinary domestic life is supposed to work. Not asking about tactics, not asking about form, asking about carpets and cleaners, the unglamorous scaffolding of a stable life that most people take entirely for granted because nobody had ever built any of that around him. Charlton, of all people, understood duty and structure better than almost anyone in English football. And for one evening, Best came looking for exactly that. It didn't last. It couldn't, not against the momentum of everything else pulling in the opposite direction. But it's the clearest evidence in the entire story that the gap between these two men was never really about talent or diligence or even personality. It was about one man having an anchor forged in tragedy, and the other having nothing solid to hold on to at all. Now here's where the story most people think they know gets flipped on its head. The standard version goes like this. George Best walked out on Manchester United in January 1974, unreliable to the last, a wasted talent who simply gave up on professionalism. Clean story. Convenient villain. Mostly wrong. What actually happened involves the manager, Tommy Docherty, and a transfer deal that was never supposed to see daylight. Behind the scenes, Docherty had been negotiating to move Best on, reportedly without properly looping Best himself into the process the way you'd expect for a player of his stature. When word of the arrangement started leaking out and the deal collapsed in public, Docherty needed a way to manage the fallout and manage his own position. The clean solution was to reframe Best as the problem. Isolate him. Push him toward the exit himself. So it looked like Best's failure rather than a botched piece of club business gone wrong in full view of the press. Best's actual walkout in January 1974 wasn't a spontaneous meltdown. It was the final pressure point in a situation that had been engineered, at least in part, by the man supposedly managing him. Best played his last game for Manchester United on New Year's Day, 1974. He was 27 years old. And here's what makes it worse. This wasn't the first time Docherty and Best had clashed, and it wasn't the first time Best had walked away only to be talked back. Their relationship had already cycled through multiple breakdowns and reconciliations by that point, each one chipping away a little more trust on both sides. So when the botched deal collapsed and the finger-pointing started in the press, there was no reservoir of goodwill left to fall back on. Docherty needed the story to be about an unreliable, ungovernable star. Best, worn down and increasingly isolated within his own dressing room, had no real appetite left to fight the narrative. He just left. 27. Let that number sit for a second. Best had roughly a decade of top-level football left in him by any reasonable estimate, and instead he was gone from the biggest stage in the sport before most players even hit their prime. This is the actual climax of the story, and it's not a moment of triumph. It's a moment of institutional failure dressed up as a personal one. A club that never built proper structure around its greatest talent. A manager who used that talent as cover for his own mistake. A player who'd been left, for years, without anyone in a position of real authority stepping in to help him, and who paid for that vacuum with the best years of his career. What followed was a steady, public decline. Best drifted through lower division English football, spells at clubs like Dunstable Town and Stockport County that would have been unthinkable 5 years earlier for the reigning European Footballer of the Year. There were flashes of the old brilliance in the North American Soccer League, playing in front of American crowds who treated him like the icon he still technically was rather than a cautionary tale in progress. For a couple of seasons with the Los Angeles Aztecs and later Fort Lauderdale, you could squint and see the old best, the balance, the change of pace, the ability to make grown professionals look like they were standing still. American crowds who'd never seen him at his absolute peak in the 60s still recognized they were watching something rare. It just wasn't sustainable, and it wasn't enough to undo what had already been set in motion back in Manchester. Because underneath the occasional flashes, the drinking, which had been a quiet undercurrent for years, was no longer quiet. There were arrests. There was prison time for a drink-driving offense that became national news precisely because it was George Best behind the headline. There were repeated, public attempts to get sober that repeatedly failed, each relapse covered by the same press that had once made him famous, now making a spectacle of watching him fall apart in real time. It's worth sitting with how cruel that cycle actually was. The same institutions that profited from Best at his most glamorous were often the ones profiting from him at his most broken, and at no point did that create any real pressure on the football establishment to examine its own role in how he got there. In 2002, Best received a liver transplant, a second chance almost nobody in his position gets. For a while, it looked like it might actually work. It didn't hold. He relapsed, and by 2005 his health was collapsing for good. That's when he agreed to the newspaper campaign, his gaunt, unmistakable face on the front page, under 3 words he chose himself. Don't die like me. He wasn't trying to rehabilitate his image. He was trying to spend whatever he had left on saving somebody else the same ending. George Best died on the 25th of November, 2005. He was 59 years old. 59 for a man whose talent, in a properly supported environment, should have had decades more to give the game in some capacity. Coaching, ambassadorial roles, punditry, the kind of graceful second act plenty of far less gifted players managed to build for themselves. The tributes that followed were enormous. Front pages across Britain and Ireland. Tens of thousands lining the streets of Belfast for his funeral, teammates and rivals alike calling him the most naturally gifted player they'd ever shared a pitch with. And all of that is true. And none of it changes the fact that the outpouring came after the warning had already gone unheeded for the better part of 30 years. And somewhere in his final days, Bobby Charlton and Dennis Law came to see him. Not for cameras, not for a quote. They sat with him, largely in silence, 2 men who'd shared a dressing room, a badge, and a tragedy that started long before any of them knew Best's name, and they said goodbye to someone whose ending Charlton had, in his own way, been trying to prevent for the better part of 3 decades. Because that's the real thesis here. Bobby Charlton was never the bitter old professional sniping at a younger, more talented teammate out of jealousy or resentment. That's the lazy version of this story, and it's the version that's let everyone else off the hook for 40 years. Charlton was the one person close enough to see the danger early, and he tried, in the limited ways available to a teammate rather than a manager or a doctor or a friend with real influence, to say something. Nobody with actual power over the situation ever did the same. Not the manager, who used Best's decline to cover his own failed transfer dealings. Not the board, who let a weak management structure sit unchallenged for years while the club's greatest asset quietly came apart in public. not the wider footballing establishment, which was more than happy to sell tickets and boutique merchandise off Best's fame while doing nothing to protect the man behind it. And really, not the press either, an industry that treated his collapse as content long before anyone treated it as a crisis worth intervening in. That's what makes the ending of this story land so differently once you know the full shape of it. It's easy to watch archive footage of Best in his final years, gaunt, unwell, a shadow of the player who once tore Benfica apart in a European Cup final, and file it under simple tragedy, a supremely talented man who couldn't handle fame. That's not wrong exactly, but it's incomplete. It quietly lets an entire institution off the hook for building no safety net underneath one of the most valuable, most fragile talents it ever produced. Charlton spent decades being cast as the uptight teammate who never understood Best. The more accurate read is that Charlton understood him better than anyone, and simply never had the authority or the language or the access to turn that understanding into an intervention that actually worked. So here's a real question this story leaves you with. If the people who could see it coming don't have the power to stop it, and the people who have the power aren't paying attention, who's actually responsible when it all falls apart? And if a club, a manager, and an entire industry can watch a warning go unheeded for 3 decades, how many more Georges are quietly heading down that same road right now, with someone standing next to them who can already see exactly how it ends? Drop your take on that in the comments. I read every one. A like genuinely helps more than you'd think. And subscribe if you want more of these deep dives into the stories football's history books tend to smooth over. Football at this scale is never just a tournament. It's a moment in time.